a den of coyote that live down below our house. And every time there's a siren that goes up Route 7, the coyotes plural start to howl and yip, and then our dogs start to howl and bark and go crazy.
How
So
big are your dogs? Are you worried about letting them out with these coyotes?
yes and no. I mean, we've got two that are larger sized, or medium sized. We've got one yellow lab. Um, I guess we're live.
We are.
We'll talk coyotes another time.
And we're live.
So Max, shall I get started? I see we have about 50 people in attendance. I'm sure the others will straggle in.
Yes.
We're all set? Okay, perfect. Welcome, everybody, to this conversation on affordable housing in Wilton. I'm Stephanie Thomas, state representative. I represent Wilton, Norwalk, and Westport. And the genesis for this conversation came about because affordable housing was an issue that took over the headlines a lot in both 2020 and 2021. As a state representative, I've received more emails and phone calls on this topic. And other than my committee and constituent work, this session, I spent the most time on this issue. And as recently as a couple of weeks ago, when I'm out and about, people often pull me aside and ask me questions. So I reached out to Senator Haskell and Danielle Dobin from Westport, because we did a similar event in Westport a few months ago that people really appreciated. So I asked if, now we're recording. So I asked if they would reprise that event, and they said yes. I'm very grateful. Thank you. And I'm meaning for this to just be a conversation to both educate and also answer questions that people have. Planning and zoning is one of those issues that most people spend no time thinking about, other than, if a development is about to go up in their town. So there are a lot of terms that have been thrown around over the last couple of years. And I feel like all these issues have gotten conflated. Are we talking about mixed housing? Are we talking about housing stock? Are we talking about segregation? Are we talking about economic development, how housing interacts with that? Are we talking about environmentalism, and on and on and on? So I thought this conversation could be a great time to hopefully demystify some of this. And we originally planned it for 1 hour, but then I asked Danielle if she wouldn't mind speaking first for about 10 or 15 minutes to really highlight where we are right now with what's happened before in Connecticut, where we are in the legislature in terms of some of the bills that came about, and you'll hear soon why she's an expert on that. So before I turn this over to Senator Haskell to say a few words before we get started, some interesting stats are out there in Wilton that came about as a part of your POCD planning. And I thought it'd be really interesting just to give you a few of them to sort of level set where we are and what some of the conversation, what data has spurred what Wilton is doing. So according to, and some of this may have changed post-COVID, but according to the data that was used for the POCD, the median household income in Wilton is $172,095. And that equates to affording a home with an estimated $683,000 value, including property taxes, mortgage, utilities, and insurance. And according to the Census Bureau in 2015, the median home value in Wilton was actually $810,700. So that means it's about 19% higher than what a household earning the town's median income could afford. And I'm sorry to throw stats at you. We're happy to email some of this stuff around later, so don't feel like you have to write it down. But in that same year, 2015, 32% of homeowners and 41% of Wilton's renters were considered cost burdened. And what that means is that they spend more than 30% of their household income on housing. The population change between 2015 and 2018 in this area, in Westport, it was up 0.8%, whereas in Wilton, Ridgefield, and Weston, it was down, with Wilton down about 1.7%. And again, we are happily seeing some of these numbers go back up, but that was the landscape pre-COVID. 82% of Wilton's housing stock is comprised of units with 3 or more bedrooms, compared to 62% in all of Fairfield County. And only 8% are 1 bedrooms or studios, and only 10% are 2 bedrooms. And lastly, the median rent in Wilton is $2,600, just over $2,600. So the hourly wage required to afford a 2-bedroom rental unit without paying more than 30% of your household's income is $39.98 per hour. So I thought that's very interesting data to keep in mind. Again, things have been changing with COVID, but those are some of the issues and problems, challenges that Wilton has been addressing for the last few years. And with that, I'll turn it over to Senator Haskell for a few words, and he'll kick it over to our wonderful moderator. Thank you for saying yes, and we'll go on from there. Thank you.
Well, Stephanie, thank you so much for organizing this and bringing us all together. I jumped at the opportunity to participate because of the incredible group of panelists that you've assembled, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the thoughts of others. So I will keep my remarks pretty brief. A lot of folks ask, why focus on affordable housing? Why is the legislature even addressing this issue? And it's a fair question, right? Some people would rather that we focus on transportation, workforce development. But what I've come to realize, even though I don't serve on the Planning and Development Committee, is that all of these issues are really uniquely intertwined. And there's some really interesting things happening here in the 26th district, here in Wilton, over in Westport, whether it's inclusionary housing zones, whether it's the POCD in Wilton. There's a lot of opportunities for state and local cooperation. So I do just want to mention, how in the world is this tied to workforce development or to transportation? I so often hear when I go door to door, and I'm sure you do too, Stephanie, young people aren't staying in Connecticut, or retirees aren't staying in Connecticut. They're picking up and heading to Florida, or young people are starting their careers in big cities. We do such a good job of educating them, but then as soon as they have that degree, they go and they start their small business or they start their career elsewhere. And it's true, Connecticut has a brain drain. We also have a problem with retirees. We have a hard time keeping folks who are older to stick around in the state where they built their lives. And I think a part of that, by the way, Connecticut is one of only 3 states in the country that saw a population decline in each of the last 6 years. So this really is a problem. And of course, the reasons are multifaceted. Some will point to how terrible the commute is. Some will point to the fact that our tax policy maybe doesn't incentivize folks to stick around. But I think a huge part of the equation is the fact that Connecticut ranks 49th in the country when it comes to building new housing units. I don't think that we can seriously expect young people to stick around in Connecticut if they can't afford to live here. And on the flip side of the age spectrum, I don't think that we can seriously expect our parents or grandparents to stick around in Connecticut if they aren't able to find anything other than a single family home into which they can transition. So look, this is a problem in every one of Connecticut's 169 towns. I'm really glad that we're talking about it here in Fairfield County. The data that Stephanie mentioned is really fascinating. It speaks to the fact that the increased cost of housing is an issue not just for people who rent like myself, but also for homeowners, right? That one thing that stuck out is 28% of renters in Wilton are in the category of severely burdened by the cost of housing. Severely burdened means they spend more than 50% of their income on housing. And that number is 16% when you get to homeowners. So 16% of the people who own homes in Wilton are spending more than 50% of their income on housing. That certainly shouldn't be the case. This is a problem that all of us are eager to address. There are a lot of different ideas, some that I think are really good, some that aren't so good. Stephanie and I had the honor and privilege of representing this community and trying to make state legislation a little bit better over the course of the last few months. And I'm excited to talk about that process tonight. Oh, sorry. Now I'm going to kick it over to our wonderful moderator and somebody I am really privileged to call a friend, Heather Borden Herve, who everybody knows, of course, is the brains behind Good Morning Wilton.
Thank you very much, Will. And thank you, Will and Stephanie, for pulling this whole thing together. I think it's really an important conversation for everybody to take part in. I want to explain to everybody how tonight is going to go. We're going to start out with a little bit of history and background on some of how the legislative changes on affordable housing and housing diversity came to be. And we're going to get points of view from all the panelists. And then I've got some questions, but then I also want to make sure that the audience questions get in there and that the questions you want to have answered get asked. So for those of you who are watching on Zoom, if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature to submit them. Anyone who's watching on Facebook, you're going to be able to ask questions in the comment section. Just a reminder, please remember that, respectful discourse will give you the best chance of having your question asked. So this is scheduled to wrap up at 8. So I want to get started. First of all, I'm going to introduce our other panelists. Let's meet, first of all, Danielle Dobin. She is the elected chair of Westport's Planning and Zoning Commission. She has 2 decades of commercial real estate and zoning experience as an attorney and investor. Danielle founded Westport Planning and Zoning's Affordable Housing Subcommittee and co-created the Planning and Zoning Council of Chairs of Fairfield County. She's an active community volunteer, chairing Art Smart for the PTA Council for the 3rd year, serving on the Stable Parents Music Association Exec Board, helping lead fundraising and outreach for the Staples Players Boosters, and helping with a variety of other PTA roles. Our other panelist tonight is a lifelong Wilton resident and architect, Rick Tomasetti. Rick is currently the chair of Wilton's Planning and Zoning Commission. He coaches multiple youth sports teams and previously served as a member of the Building Inspectors Board of Appeals, the Water Pollution Control Authority in Wilton, the Wilton Miller Driscoll School Building Committee, and the Wilton YMCA Board of Directors. As part of Planning and Zoning, he led the way on recently creating Wilton's most recent plan of conservation and development, and is a force behind the current effort at developing Wilton's master plan. Rick is the first to say he has always worked to protect the rights of property owners. And when he last ran for re-election, he's not up for re-election this time, he's still on a commission. But when he last ran, his bio said this: his expertise will help Wilton be proactive in updating its zoning regulations to ensure they are effective and forward-thinking, believing strongly this will encourage a higher level of design and incentivize preservation for everyone's benefit. I think that's an important thing to include as we have this conversation tonight. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Danielle. I know Stephanie asked Danielle to talk a bit about the background and history of affordable housing legislation, why it's such a major topic in Connecticut and debated in the legislature. And then if you could also, explain a bit about the Fairfield County Planning and Zoning Group that you and Rick are both part of.
Sure. Thanks so much, Heather. And thanks so much to Representative Thomas and to Senator Haskell for hosting this forum. And it's always great to see my buddy, Rick, who I always have so much fun discussing these issues with. So I was really pleased to be invited tonight. Before I dive into explaining the series of bills that were proposed in the last legislative session, I did want to talk a bit about how we got here to this place where towns like Westport and Wilton are subject to state law 830G, and why the state legislature is looking again likely at changes to statewide zoning laws. In other words, why are we always talking so much about affordable housing in Connecticut? So to begin with, we have deeply ingrained patterns of segregation in Connecticut. Our suburbs tend to be mostly white and our cities far more diverse. And it's important, I think, whenever we're talking about this topic to acknowledge that this didn't happen organically. Between racially restrictive deed restrictions that ran with the land and realtor agreements whereby homes simply weren't shown to non-whites, to the redlining that robbed cities of investment, multiple factors contributed to the pattern of segregation. And I want to highlight a few examples. Jackie Robinson, who most of you have probably heard of, was a superstar player for the Brooklyn Dodgers for many years when he tried to move with his family to Fairfield County. And he looked at a lot of different towns here. And it would break your heart to hear the degree of racism his family encountered in 1954. Literally no one would show them any homes. Brokers didn't want to work with them. And when homeowners saw them coming to the door, they would lock the doors and refuse entrance. Finally, a white couple that read about their experience named Dick and Andrea Simon, whose daughter Carly would become a famous singer and a songwriter, assisted them in purchasing land to build a home on in North Stamford. Some of the neighbors would later move away because they refused to live in the same community as a Black family. Whenever I look at this story, I can't help but think if this was Jackie Robinson's experience, can you even imagine what it was like for everyday Black families trying to move to Fairfield County? And I want to be really clear. This was in places like Westport, and probably, though I haven't looked at the deeds, in places like Wilton. Just last week, a friend of mine closed on a house in Westport, and she forwarded me a copy of her deed that had a restrictive covenant on it. Obviously no longer enforceable, but she was really shocked to see that it was real and it was showing up even today. So I have a number of other stories I could tell, but I'm going to try and keep this short. So with regard to the challenges Jewish people faced, Leo Nieves is a really well-known humanitarian and lawyer who lived in Westport. His family is still here. When he first moved his law practice to Westport, no one would sell him a house. And it was only when a Christian friend was willing to enter a sales contract and then assign it to him that Leo was able to actually buy a house in Westport. And what's fascinating to me about that is that now he's known as this well-known Westporter. But if it wasn't for the help of a friend, he never would have been permitted to become a Westporter. So why do these stories matter? Because when homes in this area were affordable for normal people, for shopkeepers, plumbers, engineers, police officers, Black people weren't able to buy here. They were formally steered to cities, and those cities, due to redlining, didn't receive investment or support from the government or from the private sector. People like my parents, in contrast, bought their home in 1974, not in Fairfield County, but in a different New York suburb for about $70,000. And then 20 years later, they sold it for $800,000. In the meantime, they mortgaged our house to start a business. They refinanced it to send all of their kids to college, and then they cashed out when they sold our home. And Black families in Connecticut were denied this same opportunity. So there wasn't just a huge opportunity gap in Connecticut, depending on where you're born. There's really a lot of inequality based on assets of what parents possess. And a lot of that can be traced back to how Black families were shut out of accumulating generational wealth through purchasing homes in the suburbs. So I want to emphasize that this is decidedly not the fault of people living in these towns today in any way, but it's certainly part of our legacy. And the question isn't whether we can change the past, because obviously we can't. It's really what we want to do now. How do we move forward to ensure that there are opportunities in our community for families that were steered away from our towns for decades, and also opportunities for nurses, teachers, police officers, firefighters, young people, and seniors. I think for those of us who live in smaller Connecticut towns today, the real question is, how do we open and extend opportunities, but at the same time preserve the feeling of living in a small or medium-sized coastal or rural town? And it's a tremendous challenge. Creating affordable housing or supportive housing is extremely difficult when land values are sky high. And with the pandemic rush to buy homes in Fairfield County, Westport and Wilton's property values are even higher than they were before. And a problem this immense really requires all of us to put our heads together and brainstorm with regards to solutions. And I've been so fortunate because in addition to the wonderful members of the Westport Planning and Zoning Commission and our staff, I've learned to really rely on my counterparts, the P&Z chairs in Greenwich, New Canaan, Darien, Ridgefield, Weston, and of course, Wilton. Margarita Alban is the wonderful Greenwich P&Z chair. She and I co-created this informal council of chairs to work collaboratively to share ideas and strategies on how to create additional affordable housing in a way that works for our town and reflects our concerns for infrastructure limitations, the environment, and the impact of climate change. All of us who serve as P&Z chairs care deeply about providing opportunities for housing diversity. The really hard part is finding a way to make this happen when land can cost $1 million or more for just a half acre. So that brings me to what happened in this last legislative session, where a desire to create change to address past wrongs resulted in a number of proposals, some of them somewhat misguided. So as most of you probably know, there were a number of different proposals, many of which came in front of the Planning and Development Committee. And I want to provide a short review because something that both Stephanie and Will discuss is what they expect to see in the future with regard to some of these coming back for another look. So the first bill I want to talk about is SB 1024, which proposed a lot of as-of-right multifamily with no parking. So the original proposed language of this bill rezoned all towns with a population of 7,500 and above to permit as-of-right market rate fourplexes within half a mile around each town's designated train station and with triplexes around Main Street corridors. So market rate in a place like Westport or Wilton, of course, means luxury. In Westport, that could mean $2 million for a townhouse. As of right means that there would be no public hearings or public comment in connection with these new developments. Density of up to 15 units per acre would be permitted, and towns would be explicitly prohibited from requiring any off-street parking for the new units. So a P&Z would have been required to conserve sewer capacity for these new as-of-right luxury developments instead of using it for larger mixed-use, mixed-income projects like the Saugatuck Center in Westport or some of the projects that are included in in Wilton's master plan. So by way of example, if this bill had been approved, developers could purchase homes on some of the narrow lanes with historic homes surrounding downtown Westport or near the train station in Westport, and they could build up to 15 units per acre with no parking for the new residents. And the proposal really ignored the way that many of these streets are in or adjacent to the flood zone. They already suffer from inadequate infrastructure for existing traffic, and they have huge drainage issues that are becoming more and more apparent with every storm. The original bill also included what I call a litigation enabling statute that invited constant lawsuits from anyone, regardless of whether they filed an application for development. So sorry for some background noise, but I have some dogs in the house and one of them is trying to join me right now. So the good news with regard to this bill is that fortunately, and in no small part, thanks to the advocacy of both Representative Stephanie Thomas and Senator Will Haskell, hi buddy, this bill was advanced out of committee without the really harmful provisions. And in the end, it wasn't adopted. So thanks to their, constant advocacy on the part of, on behalf of Wilton and Westport, a bill that I think would have created a tremendous amount of luxury density and market rate apartments, but very few actually affordable apartments. And none of the infrastructure necessary for these units was sort of stopped in its track. But you really need to stay tuned because something that I hope they'll address is the fact that the folks behind this bill are looking to come back with it again and really create as of right multifamily without parking in the future around most Connecticut main streets. So another bill I wanted to touch on was HB 6611, which was called the Fair Share Plan. So unlike SB 1024, this is a bill that actually focused on creating more affordable housing across Connecticut. But the affordability goals would have required towns across Connecticut to grow their number of overall dwelling units, in some cases by over 50%. Even cities like Norwalk and Stamford would have been impacted and forced to create many more units of housing. Basically, a fair share formula outlined in the bill would determine how much affordable housing each CT municipality needed to create. And each town would have the option of creating a 10-year plan towards achieving this fair share goal. If they failed, essentially, the plan would go into a consent decree with a court overseeing what gets built in a town. And the proposed numbers in the draft fair share would have really transformed small towns because building the required number of affordable units would often require market units at least a 1-to-1 ratio and even more likely at a 3-to-1 ratio. So by way of example, Westport's fair share goal was around 1,800 units, and that would really require the construction of at least 6,000 overall units, so that those 4,200 market rate units would pay for the affordable units via inclusionary zoning. And for those who don't know, because I know there's a lot of people from Wilton joining us, there's about 10,000 total units in Westport right now, housing units. That's all apartments, townhouses, single family homes. So adding another 6,000 units is a really huge change in terms of our town. And again, a bipartisan group of state representatives pushed back against this concept and said, we understand where you're coming from in proposing this, but it's not going to get us where we want to go. So lastly, I want to touch on HB 6107, AKA the bill that was actually adopted. So this was a bill championed by the Partnership for Stronger Communities, amongst other groups, and it made some smart updates to statewide zoning codes. For example, removing the word character. And that's really important because character has been used a lot in the past without a lot more information or context. And by removing the word character, planning and zoning commissioners are really forced to be really specific about why they are or aren't approving a certain project. The bill also provides for training for P&Z commissioners and for some provisions which have an opt-out for accessory dwelling units and for new parking requirements. I think the best part of this bill is that it appoints a blue ribbon commission to look at how to create more affordable housing in Connecticut in a way that works for Connecticut towns. I'm really hoping that that group can move us past the one size fits all approach of bills like 1024 and might even move us beyond 830G. I've mentioned 830G a few times. For those who aren't familiar, 830G is legislation that requires every town in Connecticut to have 10% affordable housing as affordability is defined in that statute. If a town doesn't meet the 10%, then developers can bypass local zoning laws in terms of density, in terms of where a project is located, height, number of units, etc., as long as the project is 30% affordable on site. So you've heard a lot now about how we started, the ideas that have been floating around in Hartford, and I'm really excited to pivot the conversation to actually what's happening in the towns of Westport and Wilton. Because contrary to what you hear a lot, sometimes in the press and sometimes up in Hartford, our towns have been working really hard on diversifying housing, but in a way that works for our specific communities. And I think that Rick has a lot to talk about with what Wilton's been up to. And I'm not sure if I'm supposed to pass it on now to Heather or to Rick, or to maybe Stephanie or Will. So whoever is slotted next, if you want to take it from here, I think the really positive conversation is what's to come, which is what we've all been working on and where we hope to go from here.
Danielle, I will take it back from you. Thank you very much. And actually, I'm going to hand it right back over to Rick just after 1 minute, because I do want to add to some of the data that Stephanie had given us earlier. There's actually, the 2020 census was just done, and I looked up some of the population growth statistics that came out of that. And in the last 10 years since the last census, Wilton has actually grown in population by 2.4%. And it's also really diversifying. I mean, the number in Wilton of residents who identify as a person of color just about doubled in 10 years, from 10% to 19.6%. Age is changing as well. There are fewer children under the age of 18. And somebody had asked, I see already in the question, about how many affordable units that Wilton does have. We have a total of about 6,700 units in Wilton. And of that right now, 3.58% are considered affordable. So now I am going to toss over to Rick, and I want to ask Rick if he could maybe talk about how affordable housing has evolved in Wilton.
Well, thank you, Heather, and thank you, Rep. Thomas and Senator Haskell, and always Danielle. It's a pleasure. So how's it evolved in Wilton? I would say, and I've obviously long history here as a native, but there was a point in time, I think in most of our communities, where people came to the communities for the bucolic environment and setting for the schools, places like Westport, maybe for Long Island Sound, but they came here for those various reasons, and a lot of folks felt like they didn't want any development for whatever reason. Danielle and I can debate, the past history and how you deal with it now. I'm not trying to sweep it under the rug. I know it existed, but I'm here now looking forward. But I do look back and I say, for a very long time in communities like Wilton, they really did not want any major development. Yes, there was some commercial development that went along to help the grand list and the tax base, but they really did not want, and this was, I think, the population at large, because they continued to vote in the planning and zoning commissions and the commissions that dealt with these issues, did not want to have multifamily housing or apartment buildings or even apartments over shops or stores. So Wilton is somewhat unique compared to some of our peer towns, where in Westport or New Canaan, even Ridgefield, there were a fair amount of apartments over retail, or apartments and then maybe an office downtown with an apartment above that. Wilton really had very few of those. And so when it became apparent, back in the late 70s, early 80s, that we really needed to start to address the affordable housing issue, there seemed to be a panacea in our community, which was, if we provide affordable housing for seniors, we've solved a lot of problems, right? So we have a fair amount of senior housing in Wilton, which I think is a great thing. In fact, my mother lives in one of the senior housing facilities here in town, and it's been very good for our family because she's still close. It's affordable for her. She gets to go to the local market and gets to retain a lot of her friends. So that's a good thing. But on the flip side of it, we really haven't had a lot of other affordable units that have been built, other than, let's say, the Avalons and some around the fringes. Now, some people will say, well, you need to do a better job of demanding the affordability. But the reality has been, to some degree, there hasn't been a lot of opportunity in our community in terms of the availability of land and things coming available that would be a prime target for some of these affordable locations. If you just look down at the stretch of Danbury Road from, say, the Norwalk border up and through to where the high school is, I would say up and through the let's say up and through 2007, through the Great Recession, that was prime commercial real estate with mostly Class A office space. And the idea that would have been turned into something like, just even market rate housing, much less affordable housing, just wasn't in the cards for the developers. They had other opportunities there. Certainly the backcountry of Wilton, and the 1 and 2 acre zones, did not seem to be palatable. There are not a lot of tracts of land left in Wilton. We're mostly built out. So it really left an area with, lacking infrastructure of sewer and water, kind of north of the high school. Today, and let's say post Great Recession, that changed pretty dramatically. We talk about affordability, and I know everybody has their affordable level, but there was a point up until just unfortunately, the recent pandemic, where Wilton's housing stock was very, very stagnant. And part of the issue in our community, I just want to focus on our community. I mean, there's statewide issues, but in our community, you look at it and people come here for the schools and then they pack up and leave. And very few people stay generationally like I do and my family has done. And so when they leave, it just brings kind of the next, it's almost like we're like a cash crop, right? Like the next crop comes in and they put their kid through the schools, and that's great because, part of the community that is so welcoming is the fact that we have this group of families that come into our community. But that is not the way to build a vibrant and dynamic community. And that's what our POCD sought to, uncover and is hoping to solve with our master planning, is that, the housing market as it exists in all of our communities, be it Norwalk, Wilton, Stanford, Bridge, it doesn't matter, needs a certain amount of liquidity, or actually a lot of liquidity. And there I'm talking about liquidity of people, right? We need people who want to move into our communities. And it's not just somebody, who wants to come in with a family and, buy a, colonial house on 2 acres in Wilton. We need young people who want to move into Wilton. And by and large, we need people who are going to come in before they start families. And I think that's a healthy marketplace. I think it's healthy when, somebody who leaves college and wants to come to our community and start their life, but hasn't been, doesn't have a partner, maybe isn't married, doesn't know what they're going to do with their job. I think it's important to have that group in our community. Likewise, I think it's important that people who've lived here for a long time want to stay, but might not want to stay in their current, house on 2 acres. And that let's say liquidity in the market is helpful overall. We can't just be a community where we have folks in their 40s and 50s with kids. It's not vibrant enough. It doesn't help our retail sector. It doesn't help our commercial sector. It doesn't help with transportation. I mean, all the way around, it's a bad idea. So we really are looking very hard. We're about to start our master plan, but we're looking very hard to provide those opportunities. And currently, Wilton has, last count, 4, I think it's 5 now, plans in some stage of construction, application, pre-application for multifamily homes. And there's some with an affordability component of 10%. There are some with an affordability component of 30% as the 2 830Gs that have been proposed. So we're making progress on that front, but it begs the question of the affordability. I think we look at it, we're too monocular on how we look at affordability in each community. And one great stat is, and this is pretty indicative. I mean, I don't want to talk about every number and stat, of course they didn't tell me there'd be math here, Danielle, but, one great stat for Wilton that I received today is 48% of the folks who moved into Wilton in July and August, which is indicative of past years. So it's not like I'm just taking it this time around. This has been very consistent. 48% of people who move here from Wilton are moving here from Norwalk and Stamford. A full 50% are moving from within Fairfield County. And I think that's an important thing to understand, because we are an attractive community for people to move up and into our community. We can't just look at this. While I appreciate everybody's concern about, the affordability and their cost burdened. Yeah, I get cost burdened. I was pretty cost burdened when I bought my first house. It happens. And I think if we're going to be here trying to solve that equation of cost burdening, I don't think that's an equation that we as elected officials, which I always just want to cringe when I call myself that. The libertarian saying he's elected just gives me the willies. But, as the people who are making these decisions and these policy things, we're not going to be able to solve that. That's a market force. And so while I hear what you're saying, Senator Haskell, I just respectfully disagree. I mean, Connecticut has issues with jobs. I mean, the thing we need to solve is we need to solve for jobs. We need to solve our transportation. We need to solve our energy issues. We need to solve our taxes. Those are things that will make it more affordable. And it's, there's 2 sides to this trade, right? We want to make everything more affordable. Well, there's a fixed supply of land, so we can at some point increase the supply of units, which is, I think, what Sarah Bronin's ideas were, which, I have to say, when I first read through her proposals, I'm like, great, we get rid of some regulation. Finally, somebody's listening. We'll get rid of some regulation and we'll free up and have more homes built, and the more supply will bring down the cost through the supply demand curve. That'll be fantastic. The more I read into it, the more I realized it's just kind of a top-down master planning approach, and that is not, in my view, the way we need to solve these problems. These problems, we need to set the tone, set the agenda. Yes. Each community, I know Danielle in her community is very concerned about the ADUs, and I would too if I were in Darien, Westport, Greenwich, that people were going to come to my community and build an accessory dwelling unit and rent it for the summer to use my amenities like the beach, I'd be a little concerned too. But in communities like Wilton, I think ADUs are a great asset to have. They haven't necessarily caught on as well as I would have hoped, but I think they will, since we deregulated that, which I was on the bandwagon to deregulate ADUs up to 4 years ago. I've always felt that they should be as of right. So I think there's simpler steps that we can take in terms of how we deregulate our zoning. And, you know, as a practicing architect, I see it everywhere. You put in an application, it goes through the bureaucracy, it can take months. And this isn't for big multifamily projects. These are even just, you know, your basic addition renovation, your basic new construction of a home. You know, the red tape and what goes on in getting building permits and getting zoning permits and the like is a big deal. And it has real implication and real cost factors on my clients, and therefore on all of our neighbors, on what goes the inputs of construction, which all leads to the aggressiveness of the pricing. So there are things that we can do to solve this, but I think that the 830G really needs to be stripped down and kind of looked at. I think it's the burden is on all of us. When we look at 830G, just philosophically, we look at something that says every time you build something that has, you know, you can build anything you want, basically, but you have to have 30% affordability. Well, guess what? So every time you build that 30% affordability, you're building 70 other units out of 100 that are market rate. And the reality is that those market rate units that are being built, one, they're not as affordable as we think they are. It's about $250,000 per unit to build a market rate unit in Connecticut. You know, that's thereabouts for, you know, above podium, stick frame stuff. The rest of it will be land. So, you know, it could go up to $325,000 per unit. But what have we done? We've taxed the people in that development for the folks who have the let's call it subsidized or below market rate. Well, that's not equitable at all, because now we're basically telling just the people who are in that specific unit, maybe there's 150 units or 100 units, that you're now responsible to subsidize your specific neighbor. Could you imagine if you did that at the grocery store? You walk in, Will, and then you're standing behind me, and there you go. You got to pay an extra 50 cents for my gallon of milk. We would all think that's just the craziest thing ever. So if we really want to solve this problem, we need to come to a moral conclusion as a society that says we want to provide for people who cannot or don't have the means to support their housing needs. And that should be a blanket thing. And it shouldn't be borne on just the people in a certain housing development. I think that's kind of amoral personally, but I don't want to get into too much soapbox, Danielle. But you know, and then if you also look at it, we're also now in a situation where we have you know, developers and investors, and you think, oh, well, they're just going to do this. Well, no, they're not just going to do this. And, you know, the developers I talk to all say the same thing. They don't really want to build the 830G. And the reason they don't is because there's no money in it. So you take away the market incentive, right? It immediately shaves off 25% of the valuation of their property. And, you know, and in a place like this, after you get away from, you know, the initial loan period of the no interest, you shrink down to about a 4.5% return on your money. Okay, so I got to go through a lot of red tape to build these things. I get a 4% return or 5.5% return, and you only lock these units up for 1 year. So operationally, it's a complete headache because you drive my operational costs up with all the people coming and going out of these places potentially versus market rate. Or I could take my money and I could go to Florida, or I could go to a state that is more inviting from a regulatory perspective and put down about the same amount of money and get a 7% return or an 8% return. I know what I would do. I know what any rational person would do, but yet we sit here and make it out like economics are not part of this conversation. 830G is simply a price fixing mechanism. You're pushing on a string. It's never going to work. And if you look at California, if you look at New Jersey, and you look at what they've done with almost identical 830G type legislation, the Bay Area started this in '73. And look at how less affordable housing, and look at what happened to California. So we are completely on the wrong track in terms of affordability.
All right, so then I'm going to turn that back to Will, since you kept mentioning Will so much on that. How do you address the things that Rick talked about in terms of 830G? If he's saying that 830G is broken, how does the legislature fix it, and why haven't they attended to it?
Yeah, thanks, Heather. And Rick, we're so on the same page about the problem. I really loved and appreciated what you had to say about, creating a community that's a little bit more vibrant, with a little more socioeconomic diversity, attracting some young people who just moved out of college to Wilton. That obviously was music to my ears. I just want to delve into really quickly what 6107 did, and it's been addressed sort of piecemeal, but to sum it up, in addition to the Blue Ribbon Commission, which Danielle mentioned, it goes ahead and deregulates the market on ADUs. Which
alert from system UI, sir.
My computer's low on battery. Anyways, it does exactly what Rick suggested, which is that it deregulates the ADU market. Why shouldn't somebody who owns a pool cottage or a garage apartment be able to rent it out to a person of their age? This is a way that we can very modestly increase the availability of housing that's affordable without changing.
Will, I think that maybe your computer. I think there is.
Oh, can you hear me now?
I think we're getting some sort of feedback from your computer. I don't know. Yeah, now I think you've been muted. Why don't we do this, Stephanie? How about you want to take that one then? And address some of the things that Rick had said.
I'm going to take a different approach. One thing that, and I do appreciate what Rick mentioned, but one thing that caught my attention was this notion of people paying to subsidize their neighbors. And there's one thing we haven't talked about, but I hear it a lot, and I've heard it a lot over the last few years. Many of you know, prior to COVID, I worked in Manhattan. And over the years, a lot of friends I know have talked about moving to Connecticut. Everyone, the holy grail is to get out of Manhattan when you have kids, because you end up renovating a closet into a nursery and they want to move to Connecticut. And just people I knew personally, many of them did not move here because of lack of diversity. And that could be ethnic diversity, that could be socioeconomic diversity. So this concept, the world is changing. And I think we are all well advised to think about what those changes are and what communities will look like and what values people want in those communities. So this notion of not paying for your neighbor, I know many people well-heeled enough to move to Wilton who never will, because they like being in a mixed housing environment and they are happy to subsidize a different type of person living in their building. And it is actually a commercial model we use all the time, or else we would not have name brand versus generic. If you want a name brand product, you pay a certain amount. And if you don't mind something slightly different. So I just wanted to negate that because, that may be true for some people, but not everyone. In terms of 830G, what I'll say is this. To me, it's not worth our time to discuss whether or not it works. Everybody knows it needs fixes. This is legislation that was created decades ago, and I would posit that there is nothing that works that stays stagnant for decades. I think we need to think ahead, think about how we can either throw out 830G or restructure it, but government moves slowly. It moves too slowly for me. I understand why, but it's very difficult to change something once some of these things are on the books. Danielle touched upon HB 6611 briefly, the Fair Share Plan. That was legislation I was very interested in because I thought it was moving in the right direction, although all the mathematics were incorrect. But the best thing about the Fair Share Plan, it acknowledged that not the same amount of growth is needed in every single Connecticut town. It acknowledged that some areas, because of the job prospects, because of transportation, and other values, need more housing. There are some towns, because of sewer systems or lack thereof, and because of where they're situated, need less affordable housing. And until we get that mix right, I think we're shooting in the dark. And part of the reason I fought so hard against a lot of the bills that came up this year, and make no mistake, I fought hard. I fought against my party. I fought against a lot of people. When I'm aligning with Doug Dubitsky during a public hearing, like, I have to look closely at myself. But it's because every single plan outlined in the legislation is a plan that works somewhere at some time, but they don't all work everywhere right now. And that's why I fought it. So 830G, I think we can all acknowledge it needs some fixes. And what I hope we can do in government in general is start to have the conversations that talk less about things we all know and are obvious, and start moving towards solutions. And I'll end there. I don't know if I answered your question, Heather.
Yeah, Heather, I just want to comment on one thing, because I just want to clarify. When I talk about certain people subsidizing other people, what I'm speaking to is, let's say in a community, any community, you have 102 brand new developments built. One is an 830G. You build 100 units, 30 of them are the subsidized or market, non-market rate, however you want to describe it. It doesn't matter. There's market rate and non-market rate. And then next door, you've got a similar 100 units that are not an 830G. Let's say it's just, there's some loophole. Danielle was asleep at the switch and she allowed 100 units there of full market rate housing. Well, you're basically saying to those specific 70 people that you are going to pay more for those units than the people right next door. And that's where I don't find the fairness, if you will, in the current system, is that it really should be broader than that. I think your comment, I understand your comment. It's not that people are not willing to subsidize or help somebody. We do it all day long. I mean, people are hungry, right? And we have a food stamp program for people who can't maybe afford, to have a meal. That's, to me, that's just the moral and righteous thing to do, is that we shouldn't allow people to walk around and be hungry. I also agree. I don't think we should allow people to not be able to have a roof over their heads. But at the same time, I don't think the burden should only be on those 70 people or only on those other 70% in said development. It just seems like it's not appropriate. The cost should be borne on all of us. We need to think as if we are a united community on this. And I think, so I just find that to not be appropriate. I think that there should be a better solution. And I'm also worried that what happens is it specifically drives up the cost of one commodity, and that commodity will be housing, right? Because you're basically saying the tax now is going to be on multifamily, high density housing in a certain community, as opposed to all the other housing types or other products or whatever it may be. And that's part of our problem, is we're addressing this as if affordability will happen basically with high density housing, and that's it. And there's no other metric of affordability, right? Senator Haskell was starting to say about the ADUs. We're on the same page. I'm glad they passed the legislation so that other communities could follow the lead of what I've been talking about for 4 or 5 years in my community that should be as of right. I think that's a smart thing. I think it's your property. If you want to build a place to have an apartment, or have your in-laws or your college age kid or whomever stay there. I think that's an important thing that we should all have. But that's an easier solution than saying every single high density housing will have a certain tax. To me, that's just putting more burden on the things that we all purport to say we want. Let's not do that. Let's come up with ways that we have the better infrastructure. But you take Wilton, for example. One of the things we hear all the time in Wilton is that we can't handle the traffic. So it's not always necessarily if somebody doesn't want the bigger building. They look at it and they're like, oh my God, more cars on Route 7, on Danbury Road? How am I going to take a left turn? How am I going to do that? And it's like, okay, well, maybe if we had a better transportation infrastructure, that would alleviate some of the not in my backyard types, because they have a point on that one issue. Maybe that's all they care about, because all it does is affect their life when they have to commute to Norwalk or Stamford. And so sometimes those easier solutions of better infrastructure can go a long way to help soften the blow. I mean, we heard at a pre-app last night that the developer's like, I have to pay to bring the sewer up to my property. It's going to cost him $1 million+ to do that because the infrastructure isn't in place. Well, he's going to bring that up. That cost is a burden to just that particular development, but it's indicative of we don't have the infrastructure in place throughout our corridor. It doesn't exist, which was one of the things about the Borden proposal that I found to be lacking. It was, okay, yeah, this is great. You're going to propose all this, and we're going to have all kinds of development, but how do we pay for the infrastructure? Where does the infrastructure go? Who's going to approve it? How long is it going to take? It's like zoning is a slow process. Even if we say we want to rezone things, right? It doesn't mean that property owners are going to immediately say, oh, look, default, we're going to do it. I mean, people have made investments into what they're doing. And, I'm very sensitive to that because it took me a long time as a libertarian like myself, where I think you should be able to do anything you want on your property. Anything. Danielle, I think you should be able to do that nuclear reactor, tanning salon. What do you need there? We're doing it. But at the same time, I actually,
Rick, I'm going to interrupt you only because we are coming up on time, and I know Heather has a lot of questions. Okay. So I'm going to seize control from the moderator, but I appreciate everything.
So, I want to talk about, and these are questions that are coming in as well, about what are the concrete things that we can do in Wilton, specific details. What kind of changes can you make in the zoning laws? What kind of things are you working on right now to make some of the changes happen?
Sure. So the first of all, there's a lot of changes that we're looking at taking place in the future, but we're starting simple. I mean, some of the simplest things our zoning code is antiquated, right? It was a code that was really mostly written in the 1970s, and we're really looking to reform the code. So we want it to be much more user-friendly, for the general public, but also for owners and developers coming into our community so that they have an idea of what they're up against. Because right now you come in, and this is not just in Wilton. I think this is a general statement about Connecticut. Connecticut is one of the worst places because you have all these little fiefdoms, and they all have their own special code that just pertains, to Westport and Wilton. And as a practitioner, I love it because, you could be the Wilton expert, you could be the Darien expert, but that's no way to run a government, right? So I do think when my conversations with Sarah Bronin, I think one of the things we agreed on is we could get a model code that deals with a lot of these issues that then the local communities can adopt, and the things that they think are appropriate they can add or take away, but it allows the practitioners out there and the owners to really be more on a level page when they go from community to community. And I think that'll help a lot just in terms of the, revamping our regulations. So that's a simple thing.
Don't you think that that was some part of what 6107 was? I mean, there are things that communities can opt out of and there is model code.
I think that's a good provision. I mean, look, I'm not going to be here like some partisan saying, you know, everything that everybody always does is bad. That's not healthy. That's not where we need to go to move this forward. I thought that's a good provision. You know, when you talk about educating the the commissioners, yeah, who could be against that, right? Well, I could. Right. And I can but for a different reason, for a reason that I think as a practitioner of architecture, somebody who did their thesis on urban planning, right? I look at it, I'm like, really going to make me sit through one of these education things? Okay. And I know I need to do it. I do it for my architectural license in all the states I'm licensed in. But what I fear is we start to get groupthink on that. And one of the things that's so great about Connecticut zoning is I can be in a room with different people with different viewpoints. So, we can have a realtor, we can have a business owner, we could have a retired person, we could have a student. I mean, we have in Wilton, we have one of our members just recently graduated college, and she's going to law school now. And I think it's great that we can have these different viewpoints. And so I do like that. And I just worry about some of the education. I think we need to have better legal oversight to make sure we don't have commissioners saying things that are like, no, you can't say that. That's not the way the law works. So I think we need better legal education and let the planning stuff be left to the individuals who are in the community. Because I believe that I would trust Stephanie more than some other person to talk about what she wants in her community, because she knows her neighbors. She knows what's going on in that community. She knows the hot spots there and how to solve it.
Except I'm going to add, in Norwalk, like many other towns in Connecticut, commissioners are appointed and not elected. And sometimes I know I went to training because Norwalk makes sure all of its commissioners are trained in everything from, the language, what's a setback, what's form-based code, what's,
Right.
All of these things, in addition to how to run a public meeting, which a lot of people could use some more training on, and, any number of issues, but not every town has the budget to send their commissioners to that type
Right.
of training. So
No,
I don't know.
But
I
then-
think it's a low bar, 4 hours.
It's a low
every
bar.
2
It's a low bar.
years.
It's not something, that's not the hill I'm dying on, trust me.
Yeah.
But the other things that we're looking to do is, so when you look at our plan of conservation and development, this was the first, I want to say, pro-growth plan of conservation and development that Wilton has ever put out. Because we recognize as a community, I actually think as a community, I mean, there's always different factions and different viewpoints, but I think generally speaking, as a community, we finally all needed to come together and say, okay, we see a problem here. We see that to stay a community of simply, 1 and 2 acre homes is not our future. We need to change this. And aside from that, we also said, we know where we need to put this. We know the Danbury Road corridor from Norwalk to Cannondale and Wilton Center is the place. Those are the locations where we need to study a higher density and a different type of housing. And so we're committed, and we see already, just based on our plan of conservation and development, that we've had multiple applications come through. We've approved 2 of them. One 300 Danbury Road and one 200 Danbury Road. One's under construction. One is being sold as a development project. And we have numerous others in various stages of the application process. At last check, that's potentially, and I want to say this quietly because some people get all kind of twisted up over it. And look, they're not all going to be built. We understand that, but that's potentially 1,000 new units. That's a big number for a community like Wilton. I mean, Danielle's shaking her head. I mean, 1,000 units for Wilton. Now, it will provide different price points, and there will be affordability baked into those.
So is that looking ahead to the way that some of the groups are going to continue pushing the changes that didn't happen the last time? Is what Rick is saying going to satisfy that? Is, are you going to be able to ever satisfy changes from people who don't live in Wilton and the changes that they want to make? Are we ever going to satisfy what Hartford wants us to accomplish?
Heather, that is a loaded question. I want to jump in with just a little bit about what's going on in Westport to provide just a little bit more information about what's happening, because I think what's interesting for the legislators to hear, and is interesting, frankly, for everyone who is watching to hear, is how different communities are creating different types of housing for the first time in a long time. So, Rick talked about this is the first time the POCD in Wilton has really been drafted to create different types of housing and to plan for different types of housing. So in Westport, we didn't really have a POC that I think did that. However, we have a group of commissioners that were really interested in seeking some change. So the first thing I'll do is say, Rick, I love you, but I respectfully disagree with you. I don't think that inclusionary zoning requirements, whether they're from 830G or from individual towns mandating inclusionary zoning, which Westport does, if 100 units was ever approved in Westport, it would be 20% affordable, at least, because the price of doing business in Westport is to bake in at least 20% of affordability. I don't think that that falls upon the heads of anybody who lives in any particular unit. A landlord or developer will always charge the most they can possibly get for every unit. And people who are leasing unit will always pay as little as they can possibly get away with paying for the unit that they're looking for. So whether a building is market rate or has an affordability component, those market rate units will rent for as much as they possibly can. So in a town like Westport, we require 20% inclusionary zoning. And one of the things we've done over the last several years is approve a lot of different projects that are 20% affordable. And these mixed income multifamily projects are oftentimes really beautiful. They fit with our regulations, or we tailor our regulations through a text amendment to ensure that something that works for the adjacent neighbors is being created in terms of coverage and architectural aesthetics. But that cost is really borne by the developer. And what I think is sometimes missing in Hartford is this idea that in Westport, we can say to every developer, if you want to build here, the cost of doing business is at least 20% affordable units, and they still want to come here. Versus if you did that in, let's say, Ridgefield, you might find that no one wants to build anything because the 20% number is too big. For example, our friends in Darien for a long time had 12% inclusionary zoning, and they just upped theirs after all of our conversations to, I think, 15 or 16%. So what works in one community in terms of incentivizing development doesn't necessarily work in another community. Now, I know the 20% in Westport works because we continue to get applications for really small buildings with 5 units to much larger buildings. So with regard to other things in Westport, Heather, you've talked a little bit about, how to kind of creatively address what Hartford is looking for. So I created a affordability subcommittee, and I looked for allies in our community. Our first selectman, who's from a different party than I am, wanted to get involved and has made it a town priority to come to every single one of our meetings. We have a diversity and inclusion team in Westport called Team Westport, an official town committee. They got involved, and we tried to create an open dialogue around these issues. So one of the first things that we did was begin to look for either town or state-owned land where we could utilize the resources of the town and the Westport Housing Authority to create something that isn't created through 830G. And that's affordable housing designed specifically for families. So 830G, with regard to creating opportunities for families to move to a town like Westport and access the schools for kids from families of different means, has been a colossal failure. Nobody uses 830G to design family-friendly units in places like New Canaan, Greenwich, and Westport. They just don't. So we decided we were going to do it ourselves. And in order to do that, we changed the conversation. Instead of focusing on 830G and points, instead we started talking about people, and we started talking about families. And I also found that when we started talking about people, when people talk about, oh, I hate the new apartment buildings, or it's causing all the traffic, and I'll say to them, oh, my friend who's divorced lives in that building, or the principal of his elementary school lives in the building, or young people, like that amazing guy everybody loves, Will Haskell, lives in one of the apartment buildings. It really changes the way that people view the idea of apartment buildings. So having the affordable subcommittee, talking about people instead of points, has actually put us on a path to earn successive moratorium in the future by creating a lot more points, by getting away from the conversation about points. So not only did we identify as a group what land might make sense for multifamily development, and then work with the Department of Housing and the Westport Housing Authority to ensure that what was being developed wasn't, let's say 50 market rate units with 20 of them being affordable, but instead just 20 market rate townhouse units and no market rate units. But we also looked at where we can find resources to help this. So something I'm really proud of is that at a recent public conference, our first selectman announced that our Board of Selectmen is planning on using some of the ARPA funds which is the American Rescue Plan funding, to fund some of the soft cost for affordable housing and the development of affordable housing in Westport. And I think it's really important when communities like Westport that are affluent put their money where their mouth is and really utilize some of the resources at our disposal to do something different. So instead of being a community that was the party of no, which unfortunately I found for a long time in Westport, Westport has become a community where across town agencies, people are working together to create a new affordable community for families. In addition, contrary to what Rick may have heard, Westport has also deregulated ADUs, and detached ADUs and accessory apartments are permitted by administrative approval on every single family lot and in every single family zone in Westport. And the way that we addressed our issue with Airbnbs, and it is an issue, we live in a community where literally somebody can build a detached ADU and they can rent it for $2,000 a night in August. And if we are allowing people to do that, obviously we're not creating any sort of affordable housing for anybody. We just require that any lease has to be for at least 6 months. And that ensures that ADUs aren't being used as Airbnbs. So we've been able to do that. Something else we looked at was taking the town-owned historic homes, that our town owned a certain number of historic homes, and permitting those to be adaptively reused for deeply affordable housing for adults with special needs. And the first project of that type is under development right now. Now, all of this is hard. The text amendment that permitted the adaptive reuse of historic homes for deeply affordable housing for special needs, our RTM, 2 members of the RTM petitioned that to be overturned, and I had to defend it like a defense lawyer to talk about why we did it. Fortunately, the members of the RTM P&Z committee agreed that this was a good thing, and we moved forward with it, and the petition was dropped. So a lot of these things, whether it's initially talking about the ADUs, whether it's talking about creating a community together on our own, whether it's creating supportive housing or housing for any of these things can be controversial and people come forward and we listen to them. We have the dialogue. I think creating a venue, a forum where you can have a dialogue and hear all sides is important. In terms of the lessons I've learned in terms of moving us forward, first and foremost, it's really important that people can feel comfortable saying, I'm concerned about multifamily in my town. I'm concerned about having, my neighborhood have all of this traffic. We don't have the infrastructure. We have drainage issues, because of we're really in the coastal zone in Westport. There's a lot of impacts from climate change and rising waters. People need to be allowed to articulate legitimate concerns about more dense development without feeling like they're going to be told that they're evil or they're classist or they're racist or any of those things. And we tried to foster an environment where people feel like they can talk about legitimate concerns about development. On the flip side, it's also really important to get away from the conversation about points and talk about people, because when we talk to those same people about creating opportunities for nurses and police officers and teachers and families to come and live in Westport, I generally find they really want to find a way to do it. And, Rick's approach is a little bit different than my approach. As chairs of P&Z, our P&Zs are made up of, 7 equal members. The chairs have no special powers. Everybody has an equal vote. So this is really about listening to a lot of people and figuring out what can work. But I can tell you, and it's a great message that Stephanie and Will have both really brought back to Hartford. What works in Westport doesn't necessarily work in Milford. if in Milford they tried to require 20% affordability for all multifamily, they'd probably see no multifamily being developed unless they were allowing people to go really, really tall or really, really big. But in Westport, where a market rate development can charge $3 million for a 2-bedroom, 2.5 bath, like we have right now, we can ask people to set aside quite a bit of money towards affordability. And again, it doesn't raise the cost of those units for the people that are buying it. Somebody's going to either buy the unit for $3.5 million, Rick, or they're not, and they're not subsidizing it. It's just a little less profit for that developer. But we can have an inclusionary zoning yes or no convo at a different time, because I don't want
Danielle. Nobody's taking less as a profit. It's getting passed along to the other owners. That is just, that's just not even real economics.
All right,
we'll talk about it.
Let's do this. I'd like to try.
That's not real math. That is not real math.
Let's take the ideological thing and we'll put that aside. I want to talk about some of those concrete things that Danielle, you just brought up, because Wilton has done some of them. I mean, there are smaller single homes that the town owns that are now being rented by town employees. There was land that was given to Wilton Commons that built affordable housing for seniors. There are a couple of questions that have come in about all of the office space, for instance, that we have in Wilton. Is there a chance of getting someone interested in turning that into housing? And there's, you talk about there's not enough land. Well, we've got this existing office space that a lot of it is empty. Are there concrete things like that that the town can do, whether it's planning and zoning, or whether, I don't know, it's the Economic Development Commission or things like that, that we should be doing in Wilton, that are in the works in Wilton?
Yes. So, and I appreciate what Danielle's saying. I mean, a couple of quick, just brief comments. As part of our POCD, we have formed a housing commission, which Wilton never had. So we've started that dialogue. We're starting the master planning process, hopefully within the next month, to come up with a master plan for what we consider now the greater Wilton Center area, where we're actually trying to make our downtown area grow as part of the downtown will include Danbury Road. So we're really looking at this thing a little bit more holistically. But there's a section of Wilton that runs from almost the town line at Norwalk all the way up to Lambert Commons, and that's our mostly what we call our design enterprise zone, DE5 and DE10. And most people know it because that's where the old Perkin-Elmer buildings were located, and currently that's where the biggest tech employer in Connecticut, ASML, is located. And so we do have a lot of really good Class A office space that is desirable. Now, it hasn't really performed as well, but it is coming back and getting repurposed. For instance, just north of AIG, I think it's 60 Danbury Road, has been repurposed to a medical center. So there'd be a big surgical center moving in there. So we have repurposed some of our commercial space to other commercial uses. Now, what has happened, and I can't get too deep into it because there's a pending application, so I don't want to say, so let's try to keep this generic. There are some commercial uses in town that have been underutilized. And so what you're seeing happen is you're seeing maybe some of those smaller companies either move out, and then it leaves those properties not performing at all, or they decide to move into some of the Class A office space and absorb some of that, thereby freeing up some of our smaller commercial venues along the corridor to now be redeveloped for housing. So I do think it is changing, and it will take a while, but yes, there is an opportunity, and it already is happening with a few applications that we see. So that's coming, and it is happening.
So I know you talk about how zoning takes a very long time. Is there something that the town can look forward to happening more immediately, or something that other people in town can step up and do? I mean, and Danielle, if there are suggestions that you have, or Stephanie, you.
I have one suggestion. Actually, I'll say two things. The first thing, because I didn't include this necessarily in my lessons learned, which is, I just want to say, lesson learned, it's important to have the right legislators. Both Stephanie and Will have been so supportive of everything that I've tried to do on the commission, speaking for myself personally, not, for the entire commission. and I know that other commissioners also feel they can always reach out. And when we were negotiating with the state to try and get this land to create a new housing development, both Stephanie Will, Tony Wong, whose district it's in, all really stepped up to be helpful. Jonathan Steinberg as well, just couldn't do more to help us. So having the right legislators makes all the difference. And I'm grateful all the time that we have such a terrific team representing our area. But secondly, what I wanted to say is, with regard to doing things, and I see questions in the chat, it can be very frustrating for me when I hear from people who live in Westport who say, we need to have more density here, or we need to do this and that. And it's always somebody else's neighborhood. And inevitably, the people saying this are the people who don't live adjacent to the area that they're looking to have rezoned. Very rarely, we do get people who are very positive. We have had a redevelopment of an industrial site on the post road where something called Rogers Septic was, where the neighbors who lived on a private road behind it actually came forward, got together, and were a part of the process in terms of asking us to help the developer redevelop to create multifamily there. Similarly, looking at the new community we're trying to do, some of the neighbors there have been very positive, their involvement. If people are interested in change, follow up with Rick, follow up with the other commissioners. If people are in Westport, follow up with me, but talk about ideas for your neighborhood. If you're somebody who thinks that as of right multifamily with no parking sounds amazing, please talk about it for your street, go door to door to your neighbors and get them on board. All of us are looking to create these 830J affordability plans that are required by the state. Everybody here can tell Rick and I don't agree on everything, but we have terrific conversations because we listen to each other and we learn from each other. Similarly, we do that with the other chairs. We're a really mixed group, some independents, some Republicans, some libertarians, some Democrats. It's really important that members of our community engage with us in the same vein. We may not agree on everything, but we want to hear you, but come to us with some ideas that have to do with what you should be thinking about in terms of my street, in terms of my neighborhood, because that's really impactful. And as we go through these 830J affordability plan conversations, I'm sure you'll be doing them in Wilton as well. That can really create a lot of change. When people on a street decide they want to have something different, the people on Cottage Lane in Westport did that. And when other people in town were upset at this Rogers septic system becoming multifamily, the people who lived adjacent and around came forward and they said, no, we're a part of this and this is what we want to see. And we're working with the Planning and Zoning Commission to make something happen. And that made all the difference. So, if you want to see differences and changes in Wilton, be Rick's partner. Show up at the hearings and be the party of yes. For him, be the YIMBY, the yes in my backyard people.
And I would also just tag on to that, Danielle. In a community like Wilton, what shows that things need to change is for a very long time, the regulations were static and applicants would come in and say, okay, can we do this? No, it's not in the regulations. You can't do that. I want to say over the past 4 years, the vast majority of our larger applications are coming in saying your regulations don't work. And here's what we need to do to make our projects, viable. And the public comes out and, they don't all get approved. And that's fine. Not every project is appropriate. But I think it's instructive to see when the market forces come out and say, your parking regulation in this particular instance doesn't work. And this isn't just, I think we focus so much on housing because it's so personal, right? Everybody goes home at night and there's a roof over their heads. But this goes for all development, right? There's commercial development where we all work, and all these things go into making up our market. And I think for too often, I think Stephanie, you pointed out, we're always focused on the 830G, right? We're so focused on this thing, but it really is a bigger marketplace. And Wilton has had a big issue with this because you look at, there's been a lot of kind of legacy property owners, and they look at their property and they know what the value is of the property, yet they don't get improved because maybe they don't have the money to put in, or maybe the market isn't there to make the improvements for rental or what have you. But yet when a developer comes in, they're looking at their metrics and they're like, oh yeah, well, I'll give you $8 million for your property. And it's like, you look around, you're like, $8 million for that, and then they're forced to, now the market forces come in, the economics come in. Now they're forced to build a bigger project than maybe the land will support, or maybe that the neighbors are willing to absorb in their backyard. So, we have to be careful in how we approach all of our land use. We can't just simply focus on residential, because there's residential, there's commercial, there's, the institutional ones. We really have to look at it holistically.
Will and Stephanie, I know Will is back on the call. I'd love to hear what he has to say about that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Heather. And I'm sorry about the tech issues earlier. I hope you guys can hear me. I did just want to add on to what Danielle was saying, which is that if you've got ideas, both on an individual level, but also as a town, please be in touch with those of us who have the privilege of representing these communities in Hartford. I want to really give Danielle a lot of credit for thinking about people and not points. I absolutely love that, and I'm going to steal it. I think what Westport is doing in terms of looking at state-owned land that can solve this math problem we're talking about numerator and denominator and 830G, and instead say, what underutilized state-owned land is there in our community that can be used to create housing that's not just 10 or 20 or 30% affordable, but housing that is perhaps 80% affordable, developed by the town. These are real opportunities with state land that's currently perhaps underutilized. We saw that in Westport with the DOT facility, and certainly if smart minds come together in Wilton, we can come up with a few state-owned pieces of property, perhaps related to Super 7 or others, that are just sitting underutilized today and might be better put to use in the creation of housing that's truly affordable. And Rick, earlier you mentioned the fact that we ought to be talking about jobs, we ought to be talking about transportation. I'm with you 100% on those issues, but I think we all have to agree that these conversations are interconnected, right? When I visited a business in Wilton and they told me that they have 113 job openings that they cannot possibly fill, this was 2019, they said that they couldn't get a young, vibrant, tech-savvy workforce to live in town. That's a housing problem. When I go to Hartford and I talk about how we've got to invest in the Danbury line and get more trains running direct service into Manhattan, they say that there isn't accessibility to those trains for people who can't afford a car. So let's look at what state-owned land exists around the train station, where we could perhaps do a conveyance, transfer it to the town to create housing that's transit-oriented and truly affordable. There's no one solution for everyone in Connecticut's 169 towns. Maybe the train station in Westport doesn't make sense for the next housing development, but that property that Danielle identified is along a key transportation corridor and is accessible by a bus route. So it is available for folks who don't own a car. Anyways, the conversation is so multifaceted, but we really do want to be partners, and we hope that this will lead to further conversations with Wilton about what state-owned land there is that can be used for truly affordable housing.
Stephanie?
I know we're up against time, but I do want to touch on your earlier question about what's next in Hartford. But before that, to everyone's point, housing does not exist in a silo. My particular interest in it is an economic development issue. I know Wilton's retail fry out all the time. They do not have enough density near downtown to make their businesses vibrant. You go to some towns, the downtown, you go to New Canaan, in particular, downtown bustling all the time, and somehow that's missing in Wilton, and some of it Will just alluded to. So we need to think about how to get different ages, different populations into Wilton. But in terms of Hartford, I always try to demystify this process. This is my first term. Some of it I found shocking as a former layperson. But I do want to say a few things. One, there was a lot of airtime given to desegregate Connecticut. And I can't say enough that is one group no different than any other advocacy group that does what advocacy groups do. They marshal as much support as possible and lobby Hartford. I can't tell you how many groups I've never heard of lobbied me this year, from fireplaces to, fill in the blank. There are groups everywhere. So there's nothing nefarious about Desegregate Connecticut. Second, I looked because I was curious. There were no more housing bills introduced this year than any other year in the past 2 decades. I literally went through and counted everyone. So nothing unusual there. The real truth is 830G has been broken for a long time. And as a result, people introduce bills every single year. So what I'm more interested in is what comes next, because what happens in government, I think, for expediency, people tend to reintroduce bills that did not make it. And in the absence of new ideas, that cycle perpetuates itself. So I'd like to get off that wheel and start thinking about how we can move forward. And I think we made some good progress this year, which I would like to see continued, although I do not sit on the Planning and Development Committee. But just by way of example, I'm sitting in Evanston, Illinois right now, visiting some family. And the day I arrived, there was a newspaper article about affordable housing. And I said, what's going on here? And interestingly enough, their city council had passed a reparations bill. And what they decided was to focus on housing as a route to intergenerational wealth, much like Danielle described was the problem in Connecticut. And what they are proposing is that, they also recently passed cannabis, and they propose that the first 10 million earned to the municipality through cannabis sales would be used to set up a fund to help people who were slighted during red zoning, etc., to buy housing. And I just thought, how interesting. What a new idea, something fresh. What if we did something like that for young people? What if we did, we have so many job openings that we cannot fill. We really need to keep young people in Connecticut and attract young people to Connecticut. So we need to start thinking more creatively about that. I know we are over time and Heather's giving me the eye, but I'm grateful that we had this conversation, and I hope it moves all of us, same opinion, different opinion, friends, neighbors, to actually engage in a conversation and move the conversation forward. I feel like we always stagnate on what's been wrong for the last 30 years, and I'd like to talk about what could be right for the next 30 years. Thanks, Heather.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Rick. And thank you, Danielle.
Thank you.
I think that is an important point. I think, clearly Wilton's legislators, they do want to hear from you, even if you're on a different side of the aisle, same side of the aisle. I think the conversation does need to happen. I know Rick is open to having it. Thank you all for being here. And, I don't know if there's anything else that Stephanie and Will, as the host, you want to say?
I'll just say we can't solve everything on an hour-and-a-half Zoom. Let's have conversations moving forward and get into some nitty-gritty. All ideas welcome. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you, everyone.